Some marks aren't ink. They're memories that refuse to die. The air tasted like hot metal and old dust as Ethan Cole stepped over a cracked power conduit, his boots crunching against glass sand that shimmered under the twin suns, the abandoned outpost groaning softly around him like it still remembered the people who left in a hurry, his scanner flickering at his wrist, numbers stuttering, interference crawling through every signal like something unseen was breathing just beneath the surface. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, because jobs like this didn't pay for comfort, they paid for silence, and he'd learned a long time ago that silence usually meant trouble waiting to introduce itself. A faint hum echoed through the corridor ahead, not mechanical, not quite, something alive in its rhythm. He froze, listening, the hairs along his arms rising under the thin fabric of his worn jacket. Then he saw her, not all at once, just a shift of color at the edge of vision, a silhouette too tall, too still, until she stepped forward and the light caught her skin, violet blue, almost luminous, like polished stone reflecting starlight, and everything in him went tight. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that told him one wrong move could change everything. She moved with impossible precision, a presence that filled the room without effort, her eyes locking onto him with a sharpness that felt like being measured and already found lacking. "You shouldn't be here, human," she said, her voice smooth but carrying weight, like it belonged in halls far grander than this broken place. Ethan raised his hands slowly, palms open, not reaching for the tool at his belt, not giving her a reason. "Yeah," he muttered, glancing around like he might agree with her. "Not my best decision." The corner of his mouth twitched, a habit he couldn't shake even now, because humor was easier than panic. Her gaze didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened, her stance shifting just enough to tell him she could close the distance faster than he could blink. And yet, something hesitated, something unseen catching between them. The air changed, subtle, like pressure building before a storm. Ethan felt it before he understood it. A faint warmth spreading across his chest, under the fabric, under the scarred lines of an old life he didn't talk about. The tattoo there pulsed once, barely noticeable. But enough. Her eyes dropped, not to his hands, not to any weapon, but to that exact spot, and for the first time since she appeared, her expression cracked. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition laced with something deeper, something older. She took a step back, just one, but it echoed louder than any threat. "Where did you get that?" she asked, quieter now, and Ethan blinked, confused, following her gaze. He almost laughed, tension bleeding into disbelief. "This," he said, brushing his fingers lightly over the faded ink he barely remembered getting years ago in some outpost dive bar on the edge of nowhere. "Honestly, I don't even." But the words caught in his throat because the glow was real now, faint but undeniable, lines of the mark shifting under his skin like they were waking up, and the princess, because that's what she felt like, even if he didn't have the word yet, went completely still, her breath catching, her entire presence changing in a way that made the silence between them feel louder than any battle, and Ethan realized, with a slow, creeping certainty, that whatever this mark was, it wasn't just his anymore. The glow did not fade. It deepened, slow and steady, like something ancient had finally found a reason to wake up, and Ethan could feel it now, not just heat, but a pulse, faint at first, then sinking with his heartbeat. Like the ink beneath his skin was no longer just ink. He lowered his hand instinctively, staring at it, then back at her, trying to read what had changed, because something had, everything had. The air between them felt charged, heavier, as if the outpost itself was holding its breath. "I told you, I do not know where I got it," he said, more serious now, his voice losing its edge of humor, "because her reaction was not something you joked your way through. Not when someone like her stepped back from you like you had just rewritten the rules of her entire world." Her eyes lifted from his chest to his face again, but the sharp superiority that had been there before was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Uncertainty, curiosity, and beneath it, something that looked a lot like doubt. She studied him in silence, the kind that stretched long enough to make a man question his own breathing. Then she moved closer again, slower this time, deliberate, as if approaching a line she was not sure she should cross. That symbol does not belong to you, she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying the same command. It cannot. Ethan exhaled, glancing down again at the faint shifting lines, the edges of the tattoo catching light in a way they never had before. Well, it has been on me for about 10 years, so unless someone plans on taking it back, I would say it belongs exactly where it is. There was a pause, and for the briefest moment, something flickered at the corner of her lips, not quite a smile, but close enough to prove she was still capable of something human, or something like it. She lifted her hand then, hesitating inches from his chest, her fingers hovering in the space where the warmth radiated strongest, and Ethan felt his muscles tighten, not out of fear, but awareness. Because every instinct he had told him this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would not be undone. Do not move, she said softly. And this time, he listened, not because she ordered it, but because something in her tone made it feel like a request instead of a command. Her fingertips finally made contact, light, barely there, but the reaction was immediate. The mark flared, brighter, lines shifting with a precision that no ordinary ink could ever replicate, and Ethan inhaled sharply, not in pain, but in surprise. The sensation was strange, like standing too close to a heater. On a cold night, warmth spreading outward, steady and controlled, her breath caught, visibly this time, her composure cracking further as her eyes widened just enough to betray what she was thinking. It responds to me, she whispered, more to herself than to him. It recognizes. She stopped, her hand pulling back as if the realization itself had weight. Ethan frowned, watching her carefully. Recognizes what? He asked, and for a second, she did not answer, her gaze distant, like she was looking through him at something far older, something buried deep in memory or history or both. Then she looked at him again, really looked this time, not as a human, not as an intruder, but as a question she could not solve. This mark, she said slowly, each word measured, is not decoration, it is not random, it is a bond, one that should no longer exist. The hum in the outpost seemed to grow louder around them. Or maybe it was just his pulse, because Ethan had the distinct feeling that whatever this was, whatever he had been carrying on his skin all these years without a second thought, had just turned him into something neither of them were prepared to understand. The word lingered in the air between them, bond, heavy and unfinished, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere instinct lived. He shifted his weight slightly, the metal floor beneath his boots humming faintly, as if reacting to the same unseen current. A bond with what? He asked, quieter now, because something told him the answer mattered more than the question itself. Her gaze flickered again to his chest, the glow still pulsing beneath his shirt, softer now, but steady. Alive in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She did not answer immediately. Instead she turned away from him, just enough to create distance, her posture tightening like she was trying to regain control over something slipping through her fingers. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the broken walls of the outpost pressing in, carrying echoes of a past neither of them had lived, but both were now standing inside of. This symbol, she said finally, her voice measured, careful, was reserved for one purpose only. It marked those who stood beside the royal line, not beneath it, not above it, but with it. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, though it did not carry humor this time. You are telling me this thing means I am what? Some kind of honorary royalty. He shook his head slightly, disbelief etched across his face. I fix engines and patch hulls. That is the extent of my resume. She turned back sharply at that, something in her expression tightening. Do not dismiss it, she said, and there was a flicker of that earlier authority again. But it was different now, not directed at him, but at the idea itself. No one outside the inner circle was ever given that mark, and no one who bore it was ever forgotten. The last word lingered, and for a moment, something else crept into her tone, something quieter, almost personal. Ethan caught it. Even if he did not fully understand it, he rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the room as if expecting answers to be written into the rusted panels. Well, I can promise you, no one important ever gave this to me, he said, slower now, searching his own memory and finding nothing but fragments, a dim bar, bad lighting, a needle he barely remembered agreeing to. and a feeling he had ignored at the time because it did not fit into the life he was trying to survive. I woke up with it one day after too much cheap liquor and worse decisions, he added, though even as he said it, the explanation felt thinner than it ever had before. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him again, but this time not with suspicion, with analysis, like she was trying to fit him into a story that refused to make sense. That is not how this works, she said quietly, almost to herself. Marks like this are not given lightly. They are chosen. The word hung between them, and Ethan felt something shift inside him again, not physical this time, but mental, like a door he did not know existed had just been nudged open a fraction. A flicker of something he could not place brushing against the edge of his awareness. He frowned, pressing his fingers lightly against the mark again, feeling the faint warmth still there. Chosen by who? He asked, and this time, she hesitated longer, her gaze drifting past him, beyond the broken walls, beyond the horizon itself, as if the answer existed somewhere far outside this place. By someone who is no longer supposed to exist, she said finally, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to it, the kind that came from realizing the past was not as dead as it should be. A low vibration rippled through the floor then, subtle but unmistakable, and both of them felt it at the same time. Her head turned instantly toward the far end of the corridor, her posture shifting back into readiness, but her eyes flicked to him again, just for a second, and in that glance, Ethan saw it clearly, the conflict, the calculation, and beneath it, something that should not have been there at all. Trust, fragile and unspoken, forming faster than either of them could explain. The vibration came again, stronger this time, traveling up through the soles of Ethan's boots and into his chest, syncing disturbingly well with the faint pulse of the mark beneath his skin. He turned his head toward the corridor, eyes narrowing as the flickering overhead lights stuttered like they were struggling to keep up with something approaching. That does not sound like broken machinery, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But she had already moved, her stance shifting with controlled precision, every line of her posture alert, focused, the hesitation from moments ago folding away beneath instinct. Yet not completely gone, it lingered in the way her gaze flicked back to him again, calculating something new now, something that had not existed when she first saw him. They are searching, she said, her voice low, steady, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. And they are close. Ethan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders once, grounding himself. Because whatever this situation had just become, it was no longer just a job gone wrong. He glanced down at his wrist scanner, its display glitching, lines of static crawling across the screen. Your people? He asked, though the answer felt obvious. She did not respond right away, her attention fixed down the corridor, listening to something he could not yet hear clearly. Then she spoke. They will not care who you are, she said, and there was something deliberate in the way she chose those words, like she was testing how much of the truth he could handle at once. Or what that mark means. Ethan let out a quiet breath, nodding once. That makes two of us, he muttered, but there was no humor in it this time. Only acceptance. He reached down slowly, unclipping the small multi-tool at his belt, not as a weapon, but as something familiar to hold on to. Something that reminded him he still had control over at least part of this moment. The hum in the air deepened, resolving now into a distant rhythm, footsteps, not hurried, not chaotic, but precise, coordinated, the kind that belonged to people who knew exactly what they were doing and did not need to rush. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. All right, he said, glancing at her. If they are coming for you, then standing in the open seems like a bad plan. She turned her head toward him fully now, studying him again, and for a brief second, the question in her eyes returned, not about the mark this time, but about him, about why he was still here, why he had not already chosen the simpler path of walking away. You would help me, she said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Ethan shrugged lightly, though his gaze stayed steady on hers. You were about to put me on the floor 10 minutes ago, he said. So I am going to call this even. There was a pause, and then something shifted in her expression, subtle, but real, the kind of shift that did not come from logic, but from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. Follow me. she said finally. Turning toward a narrow side passage partially hidden by collapsed metal panels, Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped in behind her, the space tightening around them as they moved, the air cooler here, carrying the faint scent of old circuits and dust, the distant footsteps growing. Clearer now, echoing through the structure with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like a countdown neither of them could see. As they moved deeper into the passage, the glow from his chest flickered again, briefly illuminating the walls in soft lines of shifting light, and she noticed, of course she did. Her pace slowed just enough for her to glance back at him, not with fear this time, not with doubt, but with something else entirely, something that carried weight, recognition, and the beginning of a truth she had not yet spoken. If they see that, she said quietly, her voice barely above the hum of the structure, they will not see a human. Ethan met her gaze for a fraction of a second, then looked ahead again, the path narrowing, the sound of approaching footsteps filling the space behind them. Then they are going to be very confused, he replied, and despite everything, there was the faintest hint of that old, stubborn calm in his voice, the kind that did not come from confidence, but from the simple refusal to break, and somewhere between the fading light and the growing noise behind them, something unspoken settled into place, not an agreement, not yet, but the beginning of one. The passage narrowed until Ethan could feel the walls brushing his shoulders, the metal cold and slightly damp, carrying a faint vibration that pulsed in uneven waves, like the structure itself was reacting to what moved through it. Ahead of him, Lyra slowed just enough to listen, her head tilting slightly, every movement precise, controlled, but no longer distant, no longer untouchable. Something had changed in the space between them, not spoken, but undeniable. The kind of shift that happened when survival stopped being an individual effort and became something shared. The footsteps behind them grew clearer, not louder, but sharper, each one distinct, measured, echoing through the corridors with a rhythm that felt intentional, calculated. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, steadying his breathing, because panic did nothing but waste oxygen and time, and he needed both. How far? He asked quietly, keeping his voice low, controlled. Lyra did not turn, but she answered immediately. Close enough, she said, and there was no uncertainty in it, only precision. She reached the end of the passage and stopped, pressing her palm lightly against a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest. For a second nothing happened. Then a faint line of light traced along the seam, and the panel shifted inward with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing a narrow maintenance chamber beyond, darker, quieter. The hum of the main structure dampened to a low whisper. Inside, she said, stepping aside just enough for him to enter first. Ethan hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but instinct, the kind that questioned enclosed spaces and unknown exits. But then he moved, ducking slightly as he stepped into the chamber, the air cooler here, carrying the faint scent of old insulation and stale circulation. Lyra followed immediately, the panel sliding shut behind them with a muted click that sealed out the distant echoes of approaching footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling around them, thick, but not uncomfortable, just aware. Ethan leaned back lightly against the wall, his fingers brushing unconsciously against the mark on his chest again, the warmth still there, steady, present, like a second heartbeat he could not turn off. Lyra noticed, of course she did, her gaze drawn to the faint glow that still pulsed beneath the fabric, softer now, but persistent. She stepped closer, not as cautiously as before, but not carelessly either, the distance between them shrinking to something more deliberate. It is stronger now, she said quietly, her voice lower, almost thoughtful. Ethan let out a breath, glancing down. Yeah, I noticed, he replied, a faint crease forming between his brows. It does not usually do anything. He added, though even as he said it, the statement felt incomplete, like it belonged to a version of his life that no longer applied. Lyra studied the mark in silence for a moment longer, then lifted her gaze to meet his again, and there it was. Clearer now than before, not just curiosity, not just confusion, but recognition, something deep and rooted, something that connected this moment to something far older than either of them should have been part of. This place, she said slowly, her eyes flicking briefly toward the sealed wall. Was once part of a network used by my people, long before the war, long before everything changed. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, absorbing that. So this is not just some abandoned mining station, he said, more statement than question. She shook her head faintly. No, she replied. It is something that was meant to be forgotten. Her gaze returned to him, to the mark, and the way the faint light from it seemed to interact with the dim surfaces around them, subtle reflections tracing patterns that did not belong to simple geometry. And yet, she continued, softer now, you walked into it carrying something that should not exist anymore. Ethan let out a quiet breath, running a hand through his hair, the weight of that statement settling in whether he wanted it to or not. I am starting to get that impression, he said, his tone steady but quieter now, less deflective, more grounded in the reality forming around him. The silence returned for a moment, but this time it carried something else with it. Not tension, not uncertainty, but the beginning of understanding, fragile and incomplete, but real. Then, faintly, through the sealed panel, the footsteps stopped, not faded, not passed, stopped, and both of them felt it at the same time. Lyra's posture straightened slightly, her focus sharpening, while Ethan's hand lowered instinctively from his chest, his body shifting into readiness without conscious thought. And in that suspended moment, with the marks still glowing faintly between them, and whatever waited just beyond the wall holding its position, the balance shifted again, not toward fear, not toward control, but toward something far more dangerous, anticipation. The stillness on the other side of the wall did not feel like absence. It felt like awareness, like whatever stood there knew exactly where they were, and was choosing not to move. Ethan held his breath without realizing it, his body instinctively quiet, every sense tuned to the faint vibrations that leaked through the metal. Beside him, Lyra did not move either, but something in her posture changed, not defensive, not aggressive, something more controlled, more deliberate, like she had stepped into a role she understood far better than the one she had been in moments ago. They know, she said softly, and the words carried a certainty that made Ethan's chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the clarity of it. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice low. Then why are they not coming in? He asked, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then Lyra's gaze shifted toward the wall, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if focusing on something beyond it. Because they are waiting, she replied. For confirmation. Ethan frowned faintly, his mind working through that. Confirmation of what? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Her eyes flicked to his chest, to the faint glow that had not fully faded, and in that glance, the answer became clear without needing to be spoken. The mark pulsed again, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan felt it more strongly this time. Not just warmth, but something like pressure, like the space around him was reacting, responding. As if the air itself recognized it, he shifted slightly, uneasy now in a way he had not been before, not because of them, but because of what he was becoming in this moment. You said this place was part of your people's network, he murmured, his voice steady but lower, more focused. What if it is not abandoned? Lyra did not answer immediately, but the silence itself was an answer, her gaze moving slowly across the dim interior of the chamber, taking in the faint lines etched into the walls. Patterns that Ethan had not noticed before, subtle, almost invisible, but now reacting. The same soft glow that pulsed from his chest flickered faintly across those lines, like they were connected, like they were waking up together. Her breath slowed, controlled, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, something deeper than recognition, something closer to realization. This is not a hiding place, she said quietly, almost to herself. It is a threshold. Ethan felt the words settle heavily, his gaze following hers to the faint patterns along the wall, his mind trying to catch up with what his instincts were already telling him. A threshold to what? He asked. And this time, she turned to him fully, and whatever she saw in his expression seemed to confirm something for her, because her next words came without hesitation. To something that was sealed, she said, something tied to that mark. The hum in the chamber shifted then, not louder, but deeper, more resonant, like a distant engine coming online after years of silence. Ethan's hand moved again to his chest, not consciously, just drawn there, and the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, the mark flared brighter, the lines beneath his skin shifting with a clarity that made his breath catch, not in pain, but in something else entirely, something like recognition, not his own, but shared. Lyra stepped closer again, not hesitating this time, her presence steady, focused, her eyes locked on the mark as if it held the answer to everything unfolding around them. "You said you do not remember how you got it," she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a weight that pressed against the moment. Ethan shook his head slightly, his jaw tightening. "I do not," he replied, and for the first time, there was no deflection in his tone, no attempt to minimize it, just truth. She studied him for a long second, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if accepting something she had been resisting. "Then it remembers for you," she said, and before Ethan could respond, the wall behind them shifted with a low, resonant sound, not forced, not broken, but unlocking, responding, and both of them turned at the same time as a thin line of light traced itself across the sealed panel, brighter than before, matching the pulse of the mark exactly. And in that moment, as the hidden door began to open on its own, the realization settled in fully. This was not something they had found. This was something that had been waiting for him. The door did not slide open like a broken panel or a forced entry. It unfolded, silent and precise. Layers of metal shifting inward as if guided by something older than machinery. A soft white light spilling into the chamber, clean and steady, carrying none of the flicker or decay of the outpost behind them. Ethan stared at it for a second longer than he should have, because everything about it felt wrong in the way something too perfect always does. Then he stepped forward without thinking, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, something that felt like recognition he could not explain. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed, cooler, sharper, like stepping into a place that had been sealed away from time itself. The hum deepened into a steady resonance that he could feel in his bones. Lyra followed a half-step behind, but she stopped just inside the entrance, her breath catching softly as her eyes took in the space beyond. It was not large, not in the way grand halls were large, but it felt vast, the walls smooth and curved, etched with patterns that glowed faintly in response to the mark on Ethan's chest, the light pulsing in sync, like a conversation happening without words. "This was not abandoned," she whispered, and for the first time since he had met her, there was no control in her voice, only awe. Ethan moved further in, slow, careful, his boots making almost no sound against the seamless floor. The center of the chamber held a raised platform, not tall, no more than a few inches, but distinct, intentional, as if it marked a place of importance rather than function. He hesitated at its edge, something in him tightening, not fear, but awareness, like standing at the edge of a memory you know belongs to you, but cannot fully reach. The mark on his chest flared again, brighter this time, the warmth spreading outward in a steady wave, and the patterns along the walls responded immediately, their glow intensifying, lines shifting, forming shapes that felt almost familiar, though he could not place them. Lyra stepped closer now, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by something more certain, more grounded. "Do you feel it?" she asked quietly, her eyes never leaving the shifting light. Ethan nodded once, his gaze fixed on the platform. "Yeah," he said, his voice lower now, steadier. "Like it is." Waiting, the word hung there, and something in the room seemed to respond to it, the resonance deepening slightly, the light pulsing in a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Lyra moved to stand beside him, close enough now that he could feel the subtle difference in temperature where she stood, her presence no longer distant, no longer separate, but aligned with the same moment he was in. "This place was built for a purpose," she said, her tone returning to something more controlled, but still carrying the weight of what she was seeing. "Not for war, not for hiding, for recognition." Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back at the platform. "Recognition of who?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Her gaze shifted to him then, fully, and there was no doubt left in it now, no hesitation, only clarity. "Of the one who carries the mark," she said, and the moment the words left her, the platform responded, a soft line of light tracing its edge, brightening, rising just slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. Ethan felt his breath catch, not from fear, but from the undeniable realization settling in. This was not coincidence, not luck, not some random mistake inked onto his skin years ago. This was something that had been waiting, something that had been built with purpose, and somehow, impossibly, that purpose was him. Behind them, faintly, the sound of movement returned on the other side of the outer wall, closer now, more certain, but it felt distant, compared to what stood in front of them, because in this room, in this moment, the balance had already shifted, and neither of them could pretend otherwise anymore. The light from the platform did not flicker. It stabilized, steady and deliberate, as if it had finished waiting and had begun evaluating. Ethan stood at its edge, feeling the warmth from the mark spread across his chest in slow, controlled waves, each pulse stronger than the last, not overwhelming, but undeniable, like something sinking into place piece by piece. He took a breath, deeper this time, grounding himself in the only thing he still trusted, his own control. Then he stepped forward, onto the platform. The moment his boot touched the surface, the entire chamber responded, not with sound, but with a shift in pressure, subtle but absolute, the air tightening just enough to be felt. The patterns along the walls igniting in full, lines of light weaving into each other in complex shapes that moved with purpose. Not random, not decorative, something structured, something meaningful. Lyra inhaled sharply behind him, her presence still, her attention locked entirely on what was unfolding. "It recognizes you," she said quietly, and there was no doubt in her voice now, only confirmation. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed ahead as the light around him intensified. Not blinding, but focused, centered on him. The mark flared again, brighter than before, the lines beneath his skin shifting with clarity, forming a pattern that extended beyond what had ever been visible, as if the tattoo had always been incomplete until this exact moment. He felt it then, not as a memory, not fully, but as an impression, a presence brushing against the edge of his mind, something vast, something old, not invading, not forcing, just there, waiting to be acknowledged. His breath slowed, his body still, because every instinct told him this was not something to resist, this was something to understand. "Ethan," Lyra's voice came softer now, closer, and he realized she had stepped up beside the platform, not interfering, but no longer holding back. "What do you see?" she asked, and he blinked once, the question grounding him just enough to put words to what he was feeling. "Not seeing," he said slowly, his voice low, steady, more like remembering something I never learned. The words sounded strange even as he said them, but they felt true, more true than anything else in that moment. The light shifted again, concentrating at the center of the platform, forming a faint outline in front of him, not solid, not fully real, but distinct enough to recognize as a shape, tall, composed, carrying a presence that filled the space without needing volume or force. Lyra took a half step back, not in fear, but in instinctive respect, her posture lowering slightly, her gaze fixed on the forming figure with a focus that bordered on reverence. "That is not possible," she whispered, but her voice carried no denial, only disbelief at something she already understood. Ethan felt it too, the weight of it, not pressing down, but surrounding, like standing in the presence of something that did not need to prove its importance. The outline sharpened slightly, details forming in faint lines of light, not enough to define a face, but enough to convey identity, authority, something unmistakably royal. The mark on Ethan's chest pulsed in perfect synchronization with the figure now, the connection undeniable, and in that moment, the realization settled deeper than thought. This was not reacting to him. It was responding to something through him. Lyra's voice came again, quieter than before, but steady, grounded in a truth she could no longer ignore. "The bond was not lost," she said, her eyes still fixed on the figure. It was waiting for its bearer. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady, his body still within the center of the light. The presence in front of him did not speak, did not move, but it did not need to, because everything about it was already saying enough. And somewhere beyond the sealed walls, the distant movement returned again, closer now, but it felt insignificant compared to what stood in front of him, because whatever this was, whatever had just Awakened in this forgotten place, it was no longer about escape. It was about understanding something that had never truly disappeared. The figure did not move, yet the space around it felt alive, like gravity itself had shifted its center. Ethan stood still on the platform, his breathing slow, controlled, but his mind, not empty, not overwhelmed, just filled with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to him alone. The light traced along the edges of his vision, not blinding, but present, like a second layer of reality revealing itself piece by piece. The mark on his chest pulsed again, stronger now, and this time. It was not just warmth, it was clarity, not in words, but in understanding, the kind that did not need explanation. Lyra remained just outside the platform, her posture steady but lowered slightly, not out of fear, but respect, the kind that came from recognizing something greater than protocol, greater than rank. Her voice came carefully, almost reverently. "It is responding to you," she said. And Ethan exhaled softly, his gaze still locked on the luminous outline before him. "Feels more like. I am responding to it," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his tone now, no deflection, only acceptance. The figure shifted then, not stepping, not turning, but focusing. The light that formed its shape condensed slightly, its presence becoming sharper, more defined, and in that moment, Ethan felt it, not as a voice, but as a direction, a pull that was both external and internal at the same time. His hand moved without conscious thought, lifting slowly toward his chest, fingers brushing the mark as the light surged in response. And suddenly, the patterns across the walls changed, their movement accelerating, lines weaving into symbols that carried weight, history, something vast compressed into a language he should not have understood, yet somehow did. Fragments of meaning surfaced, not complete, not coherent, but enough to feel the shape of what had been lost. Lyra's breath caught again, her eyes tracking the shifting patterns, recognition dawning faster now, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but undeniable. "These are not just designs," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor she did not attempt to hide. "They are records, preserved memory." Ethan nodded slightly, though his focus never left the figure, because the connection between them was no longer subtle. It was direct, the mark on his chest no longer just reacting, but aligning, the light tracing outward from it, linking him to the platform, to the chamber, to the figure itself. And in that connection, something deeper surfaced, not a full memory, but a moment, a sensation of standing somewhere similar, not this place, but like it, facing someone whose presence carried the same weight as the figure before him now. A voice he could not hear but somehow understood, a promise, not spoken, but made. His breath caught slightly, the sensation slipping away as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the echo of certainty. Lyra stepped closer again, not onto the platform, but near enough that the light brushed against her as well, her gaze shifting from the walls back to him. And for the first time, there was no question left in it, only realization. "This was never meant to be lost," she said softly. "It was meant to be found again by you." Ethan lowered his hand slowly, the glow from the mark stabilizing, no longer flaring, no longer unpredictable, but steady, controlled, like it had reached a state it had been waiting for all along. He looked at the figure again, and though it still did not speak, did not move, its presence no longer felt distant, it felt acknowledged, and somewhere beyond the chamber, the faint sounds of movement grew closer, the waiting no longer patient, the search narrowing. But it did not matter in the same way it had before, because whatever had just awakened here, whatever had recognized him and been recognized in return, had already changed the balance of everything around them, and Ethan knew, without needing to say it out loud, that walking away from this was no longer an option. The shift was subtle at first, not in the light, not in the figure, but in Ethan himself, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with decision. He stood on the platform with the mark steady and alive beneath his skin, and for the first time since stepping into this place, he realized something simple and unavoidable. This was not happening to him. This was asking something of him. The thought settled deep, heavier than the air around him. Lyra watched him from just beyond the edge of the platform, her posture still, her eyes sharp, but no longer guarded, no longer distant. She was waiting, not for the chamber, not for the figure, but for him. "You feel it," she said quietly. Not a question, and Ethan nodded once, slow, controlled, his gaze still locked forward. "Yeah," he said, his voice lower now, grounded. "It is not just showing me something. It is expecting something back." The words hung there, and the moment they settled, the chamber responded, the light along the walls shifting again, slower this time, more deliberate, like a system adjusting to input it had been waiting for. The figure before him sharpened further, its outline clearer, more defined, and though it still did not speak, the presence behind it became undeniable, focused, aware, not of the room, not of Lyra, but of him alone. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand rising again to the mark, but this time not out of instinct, out of intention. His fingers pressed lightly against the fabric, feeling the steady pulse beneath, and instead of resisting it, instead of questioning it, he leaned into it, just enough to acknowledge it. The effect was immediate. The light surged, not outward, but inward, converging toward him, toward the platform, toward the connection that had been building since the moment he stepped inside. Lyra's breath caught softly, but she did not interrupt, she did not move, because she understood now. This was not something she could guide, not something she could control. This was his. The figure responded in kind, its presence intensifying, not overwhelming, but unmistakably engaged, and in that engagement, something finally broke through, not a voice, not words, but meaning, clear and direct, a single concept that carried weight far beyond its simplicity, recognition. Ethan felt it settle into place, not as something new, but as something returned, something that had always been part of him whether he understood it or not. His shoulders straightened slightly, his stance shifting not into defense, not into readiness, but into alignment. And in that moment, the hesitation that had followed him since the beginning of this encounter fell away completely, replaced by something quieter, stronger, certainty. "What is it asking you?" Lyra's voice came again, softer now, but steady, anchored in trust that had formed faster than either of them could have predicted. Ethan did not look at her this time. He did not need to, because the answer was already there, already forming. "Not asking," he said, his voice calm. "Even. It is confirming." The platform beneath him responded, a deeper resonance building, the light stabilizing into a steady glow that filled the chamber without flicker, without uncertainty. The patterns along the walls slowed, settling into fixed forms, no longer shifting, no longer searching. They had found what they needed. Lyra stepped forward then, just to the edge of the platform, her gaze moving between Ethan and the figure, and in her expression there was no longer doubt, no longer confusion, only realization, full and undeniable. "Then it has chosen," she said quietly, and for the first time, there was no distance in her voice when she spoke to him, no separation between human and alien, no hierarchy, only acknowledgment. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes, and in that brief glance, everything that had changed between them was clear, not spoken, not defined, but real. Then the chamber shifted again, not in light, not in structure, but in awareness, and beyond the walls, the presence that had been waiting no longer felt distant. It felt close, immediate, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what they were before, but by what had just been recognized. The moment stretched, not with hesitation, but with weight, the kind that settles after a decision has already been made. Ethan stood at the center of the platform, the light no longer searching, no longer shifting, but steady, anchored to him in a way that felt permanent. The mark on his chest pulsed once more, slower now, controlled, like it had reached its intended state. And with that final shift, the figure before him changed, not in shape, not in form, but in presence. It was no longer something distant or observing. It felt complete, as if whatever it had been waiting for had finally aligned. Lyra stepped closer, just enough that the edge of the platform brushed against her boots, her gaze steady, unwavering, but no longer questioning. "Then it is done," she said quietly, and there was no doubt in her voice, only acknowledgment of something that could not be undone. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension that had followed him since the beginning of this encounter releasing in a controlled breath. Not because the situation had become safe, but because it had become clear. He lowered his hand from his chest, the warmth still there but no longer demanding his attention. It had settled into him, part of him now in a way that felt natural, as if it had always been there beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice steady, grounded. "Feels like it." The chamber responded to that quiet certainty, the light along the walls dimming slightly, not fading, but stabilizing into a constant glow, the patterns no longer shifting, no longer searching. They had found what they needed. The figure before him began to recede, not disappearing, but dissolving into the surrounding light, its presence no longer required in the same way. As if its purpose had been fulfilled, Lyra watched it carefully, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something in her posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She straightened fully, her shoulders aligning, her presence returning to something regal, composed, but no longer distant from him, not above, not below, but beside. "They will feel this," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty, her gaze shifting toward the sealed walls of the chamber. "Everyone connected to the old network will know that the bond has been restored." Ethan followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at the platform beneath his feet, at the faint glow that still lingered there. Then, "Hiding is not really an option anymore," he said, not as a complaint, not even as concern, just a statement of fact. Lyra's eyes returned to him, and for a brief moment, something almost like a smile touched the edge of her expression, not amusement, but recognition of the same understanding. "It never was," she replied, and there was no harshness in it, no judgment, just truth. The faint sounds beyond the chamber walls shifted again, no longer distant, no longer searching blindly, but focused, directed. The waiting had ended, and whatever stood beyond now knew exactly where to look. Ethan stepped back from the center of the platform, the light adjusting seamlessly as he moved. No resistance, no hesitation, as if it had already accepted him as part of its system. He turned slightly toward Lyra, meeting her gaze fully this time, and in that look, there was no trace of the distance that had defined their first encounter. No hierarchy, no division, only alignment. "So what happens next?" he asked, and though the question was simple, it carried the weight of everything that had changed. Lyra held his gaze for a second longer, then turned toward the sealed entrance, her posture steady, composed, but no longer defensive, not bracing, but ready. "Now," she said, her voice calm, resolute, "we show them that the past did not disappear." She paused briefly, her eyes flicking back to him, not as a test, not as a question, but as acknowledgment. It waited, and with that, the chamber behind them remained still, stable, but the world beyond it was already moving toward them, and this time, neither of them stepped back. The door did not open with force. It released, the sealed panel behind them sliding apart in a smooth, controlled motion as if responding not to intrusion, but to invitation, the light from the chamber spilling outward into the dim corridor beyond, cutting through dust and shadow in a clean, steady line. Ethan stepped down from the platform without hesitation, the shift in height barely noticeable, but the shift in presence unmistakable, the mark on his chest no longer pulsing for attention, but settled, aligned, like it had found its place and had no need to prove it anymore. Lyra moved with him, not ahead, not behind, but beside, her posture straight, composed, the quiet authority in her presence no longer guarded, no longer defensive, but fully realized, as if something in her had settled as well. The corridor outside felt different now, the hum sharper, the air carrying a faint tension that had not been there before. Footsteps echoed from the far end, clearer now, measured and deliberate, and this time, they did not stop, they advanced. Ethan slowed just enough to match Lyra's pace, his gaze steady forward, his breathing even, not preparing for conflict, but for something else entirely. Something that felt closer to inevitability than confrontation. "They are not hiding anymore," he said quietly, and Lyra nodded once, her eyes focused ahead. "No," she replied, "they are coming to see." The words settled between them, and for a moment, there was no urgency, no rush, only clarity, as the figures at the end of the corridor came into view, tall, composed, their movements precise. their attention fixed entirely on the two of them, not chaotic, not aggressive, but controlled, purposeful, the kind of presence that carried authority without needing to announce it. Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in atmosphere, not hostile, but heavy with expectation. His hand did not move to his chest this time. It did not need to. The mark remained steady, present, like a quiet signal that no longer needed to flare to be understood. Lyra slowed to a stop, and Ethan did the same. The distance between them and the approaching group closing to a point where details became clear. The subtle glow of their uniforms, the precision in their posture, the way their attention did not waver, not even for a second. One of them stepped slightly forward, not breaking formation, but defining it. And in that movement, there was no threat, only intent. Lyra's chin lifted slightly, her presence shifting into something unmistakably regal. But when she spoke, her voice did not carry command over Ethan. It carried alignment with him. "They have come to witness," she said softly, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady, not defiant, not submissive, simply present. The space between them held for a moment longer, and then something subtle changed. The figure at the front lowered their head, just slightly, not a full gesture, not exaggerated, but deliberate, meaningful, and the rest followed, one after another, a quiet ripple of acknowledgment moving through the group. The corridor fell silent, not from absence, but from recognition. Lyra's breath caught softly, the sound barely audible, but enough, because she understood what that gesture meant, what it represented. Ethan stood still, the weight of the moment settling around him, not heavy, not crushing, but undeniable, and for the first time since this had begun, he realized something simple, something clear. This was not about proving anything, not about becoming something new. It was about being recognized for something that had always been there. The mark remained steady against his chest, no longer reacting, no longer searching, because it no longer needed to. And as the silence stretched between them, filled not with uncertainty, but with quiet understanding, the shift completed itself, not with a declaration, not with force, but with something far more powerful: acknowledgment. The silence did not break. It settled, deep and complete, like the final note of something that no longer needed to be explained. Ethan stood there in the center of it, the corridor stretching behind him, the chamber still glowing softly at his back. And for the first time since this began, nothing in him felt out of place. The mark against his chest remained steady, not warm, not pulsing, simply present, like a quiet truth that no longer needed to announce itself. The figures before him held their lowered posture for a moment longer, then slowly, deliberately, they straightened, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in acknowledgment that had already been given and would not be taken back. Lyra stood beside him, her presence calm, grounded, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now, something that did not come from her title, but from her choice. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him, and in that glance, there was no distance left, no barrier of species or status, only understanding. "They see you," she said softly, and her voice carried no surprise, only certainty. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on the figures ahead. "Feels more like they remember something," he replied, and as the words left him, he realized they were true in a way he could not fully explain, because this moment was not about introduction, it was about recognition. Something that had been lost and was now standing in front of them again, not restored through force, not claimed through power, but simply found. One of the figures stepped forward again, just a single pace, enough to close the distance slightly, their movement controlled, deliberate, and when they spoke, their voice was calm, measured, carrying the same weight as the chamber behind Ethan. "The bond is active," they said, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as confirmation of something already understood. Ethan did not look away, did not hesitate. "Yeah," he said quietly, and there was no need for more, because everything else had already been made clear. The figure inclined their head again, slightly deeper this time, and the rest followed, a second wave of acknowledgment, more certain, more grounded, and in that simple motion, the tension that had lingered in the corridor dissolved completely, replaced by something far quieter, far more powerful: acceptance. Lyra's breath softened beside him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something that had not been there before, not even in the chamber. Then it is not just the past that returns, she said, her gaze shifting from the figures back to him. It is what we choose to do with it. Ethan let out a small breath, the kind that came after a long road finally made sense, his shoulders relaxing slightly, not because the path ahead was easy, but because it was clear. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the corridor ahead, at the figures who no longer stood as obstacles, but as witnesses. Then I guess we stop pretending it is gone, he said, and there was no edge in his voice, no defiance, just quiet certainty. Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried everything that had changed between them. And then, without another word, she stepped forward, not leading him, not following him, but walking beside him, and Ethan matched her step without hesitation, the two of them moving forward together as the corridor opened ahead, the figures parting slightly, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of recognition of what stood between them. The chamber behind them remained lit, steady, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, and as they passed through the space that had once held uncertainty and now held something else entirely, the final shift settled into place, not with noise, not with declaration, but with something far more enduring, a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken. He was not chosen because he was powerful, he was recognized because he chose, and that, more than anything else in the vast silence of space, was what made humanity impossible to ignore.